NASA indeed has postponed its launch of the moon mission that was scheduled to take place right now.
Yeah, crews discovered multiple issues as they prepared for the flight this morning. So we want to bring in Pat Duggins. He's here to provide some analysis for us. He's the news director at Alabama Public Radio. Pat is also a former NASA reporter who has been covering the space program since 1986, and he has written 2 books about NASA. And, of course, Dr. Jim Bell, he's also with us. He's a professor at the Arizona State University School of Earth and Space Exploration. He's also the deputy principal investigator for the Luna H MAP mission, a planetary science mission operated by Arizona State University. Because there are a lot of experiments and different things that were meant to go up into deep space as well.
So, Pat and Jim, welcome to you both on what now is such a disappointing morning. But, Pat, this is part of the procedure. Start with what happened.
Well, Errol, everything was going fine if you don't count the 3 lightning strikes at the launch pad, which is enough to put anybody off. But they had at least 2 hydrogen leaks on the new Artemis 1 rocket. And it's part of the fuel supply for the main engines. Number one, you want to be able to have all the thrust possible to make it to orbit. But also, most importantly, if that hydrogen leaks out, it's invisible. You can't see it. And so if it collects around the bottom of the launch pad and then the engines ignite, you could have an additional bang at the launch pad. And you don't want that because that could possibly damage the engines. That's not exactly an auspicious way for NASA to begin this rather expensive unmanned trip to the moon. So better safe than sorry.
So we know, Pat, that the next sort of tentative date is going to be Friday. I'm just curious about all the factors that have to be considered to determine the launch date, a relaunch date.
Well, the big deal is how bad the leaks are. If you, let's say, if you go back to 1990, NASA went through what was known as hydrogen summer, where there was a hydrogen leak on the space shuttle, on multiple space shuttles, and that delayed for like 3 months, for example, a mission to go study ultraviolet energy sources up in space. So they have to lock that down first. You can't sort of launch like this. The vehicle has to go perfectly because they're really also pushing it to the very limit in terms of thrust, in terms of stress, in terms of how the Orion capsule that will hopefully take astronauts back to the moon, it all has to work. So I've spoken to NASA engineers before, and they say they don't want to go until they have what's known as the warm tummy feeling. If they have that and they think all of the issues have been taken care of, then they'll go for launch. Maybe Friday, could be next Monday, just whenever the spacecraft is ready to go.
Usually a bit of hot chocolate does that for me, but
The warm tummy feeling.
Perhaps a little bourbon, but it's probably not the same for NASA scientists.
And Dr. Bell, you're one of the leaders of a team at ASU working on an effort to map water on the moon. Just one of the many reasons why so many people are excited about this mission specifically. Tell us how that is going and how it ties into what NASA is doing here now.
Right. Yeah, you're right, Earl. And there's no people on this rocket, but there are 10 small spacecraft that are being sent to the moon, little robotic spacecraft. Like the Luna MAP mission that you mentioned that Arizona State University is leading. This is a spacecraft it's like the size of a family-size Cheerios box, cereal box. And they're very small, but very, very capable. We've got an instrument on board that once it gets into orbit around the moon, and Artemis 1 rocket will help put these spacecraft into deep space, including ours, in orbit around the moon. And we'll pass very close over the south pole of the moon in orbit and map those water ice deposits that are buried in those permanently shadowed craters. And water ice, of course, is a potential resource for future astronauts, future bases on the moon, et cetera. So lots of science is going to happen on this mission once it gets off the ground.
So you sort of alluded to what I was going to ask you about, Dr. Bell, because every time people hear about, water on either a planet or the moon, they start saying, oh, could there be life? Could there be life? Like these are the building blocks for life. But really, this entire mission is about the ability to get astronauts on the moon and then beyond for long periods of time. And so are we looking at the possibility of using the resources that are already found on the moon to have extended missions? Is that what your experiment is about a little bit?
Partly. I mean, partly it's about finding potential resources for astronauts and bases of the future. Partly it's purely scientific. I mean, some of this ice could be from comets that crashed into the moon billions of years ago, from distant parts of our solar system. So there's some great planetary science and understanding of our solar system and the Earth-Moon system that's perhaps stored in that ice. So that's part of it as well. But to your main point, sure, right? We haven't been on the moon in 50 years. We haven't been in deep space with people in such a long time, beyond just Earth's orbit. We need to relearn how to do those things, how to get and land on the moon and work there and build structures there and all that. Of course, it's a stepping stone in many ways to get to Mars, which is an even more difficult destination to get to, much longer travel time, very harsh environment. So it's really about taking those first steps back into a more long-term and perhaps permanent human presence in deep space.
And all of this, big picture-wise, is trying to kind of get to an occupied, a staffed mission to the moon. This, though, was going to be an unmanned, an unwomaned rocket spinning around the moon to test out what could be done. Pat, could you just explain how this mission will eventually work with no crew on board?
Well, anytime you fly a vehicle like that for the first time, you really just don't know how it's going to operate. I mean, when the space shuttle took off for the very first time, they didn't take into account lift on the wings. So the vehicle basically went into the wrong orbit. And I was asking astronaut John Young about that one time. He commanded that flight, and he also walked on the moon in Apollo 16. And he just shrugged his shoulders and said, none of my other flights went to the right orbit either. We just do a course correction and you get there. So they want to iron out as much of the stresses and problems that the Orion space capsule is going to go through, and then have it go through that very, very dangerous re-entry into Earth's atmosphere much faster than the Apollo vehicles. And because the capsule is so much bigger, this is something else that really kind of bothered John Young quite a bit. The heat shield is larger too, so the larger heat shield means more opportunities for a flaw, and that's what caused the fatal crash of Space Shuttle Columbia. So you really want to make sure the vehicle is safe, the vehicle is ready to go, and then you can put some astronauts on there in fact, that would go ahead maybe in the year 2025 and try to make that lunar landing.
Like, this is a deep space mission, and we haven't done this in a while. So there's all this kind of technology that in a way needs to be dusted off and see if we even know how to use it. Do we know how to communicate in deep space? What happens when you pass sort of GPS capabilities, right? And I found this really fascinating. Like, one of the challenges that they've had to deal with is how do you keep the clocks straight? That to make sure that the clocks on Earth are synchronized with the clock on board the rocket,
That's
right? Because
fascinating.
timing is everything. And so these are all little things that they have to make sure they get right before they can move on to the next chapter in this. And so that brings me to my question, Dr. Bell. After Artemis 1, what's next?
What's next? Well, as Pat noted, there will be additional flights of this rocket. The next flight will be with a crew on board. They won't land on the moon, but they'll go around the moon. It'll be the first crew test of Artemis and Orion. And then the plan right now is that on the third flight, which could be 2, 3, 4 years from now or more, we'll have a crew that will land on the moon. That'll get our first astronauts back on the moon in more than 50 years by then, of course, and start that process of relearning how to live and work in that environment, how to build things, how to start putting infrastructure together, as well as collecting samples and doing all kinds of great science. One of the legacies of the Apollo program is not just that, we beat the commies to the moon. It was that we did amazing science and learned so much about our own planet, the Earth, as well as the moon. And we're expecting great science to come out of the Artemis missions as well. When that will lead to Mars missions is still TBD. These are initial steps, and we're all looking forward to NASA and other space agencies working with NASA, putting that plan together to eventually get people all the way out to Mars.
Pat, before I let you go, I just want to sort of remind people, what NASA keeps saying is they want to put the next man on the moon and the first woman on the moon. But Pat, there are a lot of women that have been involved in this launch. I think the launch commander is a woman. It's the first time ever. I don't know if, because you are, sort of a space journalist, can you talk a little bit about the impact of women, particularly when it comes to the Artemis, this whole program?
Well, personally, it always bothered me whenever they say the first woman to do this in space or the
Yeah.
worst woman to do that in space. If you look at their resumes, I mean, they've got more PhDs than you and I have socks. So obviously, they're eminently qualified and know what they're doing. Going all the way back to the Mercury 13. Now we know about the Mercury 7, like Gus Grissom and John Young and all those, John Glenn and all those guys. But there were also 13 women who were eminently qualified to go up on Mercury missions. That was at the very dawn of the space program in the United States, and they just weren't allowed to have that opportunity. I had the opportunity to interview Eileen Collins, the woman who was the first female pilot of the space shuttle, and also the first female commander on a rather dicey mission to launch an X-ray observatory that almost went very badly for NASA. And there's a tremendous amount of women who've done really great things for the space program up in Huntsville. And oh my gosh, the reason that reporters carry notebooks is because I'm blanking on her name. But the lady mathematician they made a movie about. Yeah. I mean, John Glenn, the first man in orbit, specifically requested that she do the computations on his orbital path because he trusted her that much. So unfortunately, for a long time, call it the 60s, call it the 70s, these women had to work in the background. But now all of a sudden they're starting to get their just due. And I think it's great because there's, if you'll pardon the pun, there's space for everybody.
Pat Duggins and Dr. Jim Bell, thank you both so much. Pat, before I let you go, what is that object over your left shoulder? I get obsessed with our experts' backgrounds these days. What are we looking at there? Just quickly before we go.
Well, let's see. If you mean the bronze medallion, that's one of our Sigma Delta Chi awards from Alabama Public Radio. They're referred to as the Junior Pulitzers. The spacecraft that you're seeing there, actually, it is a very, very, very old model of the original Apollo spacecraft. Not only the command module where the astronauts went to and from the moon, but also that spidery bug-like lunar module where Neil Armstrong was able to say, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." That's
very cool.
Well, space kitsch.
A 10 out of 10 from my room raider background. But thanks to you both, Pat Duggins and Dr. Jim Bell. We appreciate you joining us on this disappointing but very important day. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
A new CBS Reports documentary looks at the Artemis mission and what's gone into this massive effort so far. You can stream Artemis, America's new moonshot, on the CBS News app or by heading to cbsnews.com/Artemis.